Good afternoon, good evening, good night, everybody. We got a special report tonight. On this thing right here. Yeah, one of these old doohickeys. You ever heard of them? Yeah. Anyways, I think what I'm tasked to do is read it. All right, here we go. Oh, sorry. All right, let's do this. Oh man, I ain't reading glasses. Okay. The following selection comes from the opening chapter of Peter Kolchin's imaginative book comparing American slavery and Russian serfdom. The two systems of human bond. I'm sorry, everybody. Hold on. Before I continue reading, I want you to ponder these two questions. Maybe just one. How did the English choose the type of labor in the colonies? And this mostly focusing on indentured servitude and slavery, and how that kind of ended up. All right, I apologize. Restart. The following selection comes from the opening chapter of Peter Kolchin's imaginative book comparing American slavery and Russian serfdom. The two systems of human bondage developed at roughly the same time and became firmly entrenched by the 1750s and played similar economic and social roles in the two countries. In this exact in this extract, Kolchin confronts the question of why the American elite embraced the forced labor. As you read it, you should keep several questions in mind. Why did the wealthier colonists continue to rely on European indentured servants long after the arrival of the first African slaves? Why did white indentured servitude in some colonies eventually give way to black slavery? What was the importance of race in all this? And finally, why did the elite fear the giddy multitude before 1700, and servile insurrection after 1700? How significant was this change? Okay, yeah, just keep that in mind. Shortage. Oh wow. Excuse me. A shortage of laborers plagued English. Sorry, I don't have YouTube Premium. You good? Yeah, we're good. A shortage of laborers plagued English settlers in the American colonies, and this situation led to the use of physical compulsion to secure workers. A vast abundance of virgin land together with a paucity of settlers defined the problem in all the mainland colonies. Everywhere, land was plentiful and labor scarce. Excuse me. To attract laborers, the colonists consequently found it necessary to pay wages that in Europe would have been considered exorbitant. Poor people, both men and women of all kinds, can here get 3 times the wages for their labor they can in England or Wales, reported an observer from Pennsylvania in 1698. And all the colony's complaints were rampant about the high cost of labor and about the resulting lack of submissiveness among much sought after workers. The law of supply and demand rendered unsuccessful the early efforts of several colonial governments to legislate maximum wages. Both skilled and unskilled labor continued to command wages up to twice those prevalent in England. The payment of high wages proved inadequate, however, to secure a sufficient number of workers, and in every colony, highly paid free labor was supplemented by forced labor of one type or another. Like the Spaniards to the south, although with less success, the English forced Indians to work for them. Indian slavery was the most prevalent in South Carolina, where 1708 where the 17 excuse me, where in 1708 the government. Sorry, hold on. Wow, good reader. Huh? Okay. In 1708, the governor estimated that there were 1,400 Indian slaves in a population of 12,580. But Indians also served as house servants and occasional laborers in other colonies. New Jersey will reveal the continued presence of small numbers of Indian slaves at the colony as late as the middle 18th century. What did I just say? Dude, it's the middle of the night, man. Okay. Okay, just gotta lock in here. But Indians also served as house servants and occasional laborers in other colonies. New Jersey wills reveal the continued presence of small numbers of Indian slaves that in that colony as late as the middle of the 18th century. For a variety of reasons, however, Indian slavery never became a major institution in the English colonies. The proximity of the wilderness and of friendly tribes made escape relatively easy for Indian slaves. The absence of a tradition the absence of a tradition of agricultural work among East Coast Indian males, women customarily performed the primary field labor, rendered them difficult to train as agricultural laborers because they were of malicious, surly, and revengeful spirit, rude and insolent in their behavior, and very ungovernable. Massachusetts legislature forbade the importation of Indian slaves in 1712. Finally, there were not enough Indians to fill the labor needs of the colonists. In New England, for example, most of the natives present when the Puritans arrived died from illness and war during the next half century. The policy of eliminating the threat of Indian attack by eliminating the Indians themselves proved in the long run compatible with widespread use of Indians as slaves incompatible with the widespread use of Indians as slaves and necessitated the importation of foreign laborers. You know what that means? The greater part of the 17th century, the colonists relied on the most obvious source of their labor, other Europeans. Although more prevalent in some colonies than in others, indentured servants were common everywhere in the 17th century in America. Most served between 4 and 7 years in exchange for free passage from Europe to America, although some were kidnapped and others transported as criminals. All found themselves highly prized commodities. In many colonies, such as Virginia, settlers received a head right, often 50 acres, for every person they imported. But even without such incentives, colonists eagerly snapped up newly arriving stocks of servants who performed vital functions as agricultural laborers, domestics, and artisans. These immigrant servants, as well as colony-born Americans bound out for poverty, debt, or crime, were virtual slaves during their periods of indenture, bound to do as their masters ordered, subject to physical chastisement, forbidden to marry without permission, and liable to be bought and sold like slaves. Some were forcibly separated from their relatives, although few servants became prosperous and influential in their later life. For most, the future was decidedly less rosy. In the middle 17th century, close to half of the servants in Virginia and Maryland died before their terms of indenture were complete. Once freed, many males continued to labor for others, living in their households, and often, because of the excess men over women, remained unmarried. Finally, the colonists turned to Africa for labor. As early as 1619, the forced labor of blacks supplemented that of whites in Virginia. By the middle of the 17th century, blacks were to be found in all in all the existing English colonies. Nevertheless, what is most striking about the early African labor force is that the length of time it took for slavery to replace the indentured servitude. Throughout most of the 17th century, white laborers, not black, prevailed in the English mainland colonies, and it was only between 1680 and 1730 that slaves became the backbone of the labor force in the South. This pattern raises two interrelated questions. Why, despite the presence of some slaves, did the colonists continue for so long to rely primarily on indentured servants, and why, during the half-century beginning in the 1680s, Did African slaves replace European servants in most of the colonies? Hold on. Pepsi has an awful aftertaste. Despite the prevailing labor shortage, there were certain limitations on the colonists' demand for slaves. Very few could afford to buy them during the first 3 quarters of the 17th century. Most early settlers were people of the fairly modest means, for whom the purchase of a servant, at one-third to one-half the price of an African slave, represented a substantial investment. Even if one could afford the initial outlay, the high mortality rate among inhabitants of the early southern colonies made the purchase of slaves risky. Servants who were held for only a few years may have represented a better buy. Not only were servants cheaper than slaves, but their successful management required smaller investments of time and effort. They usually spoke the language, at least of the 17th century, when most of them came from the British Isles, and were at least partially familiar with the agricultural techniques practiced by the settlers. Given the circumstances, as long as European servants were repeatedly available, their labor continued to make sense for most colonists. Precisely such conditions may prevail during the first 3 quarters of the 17th century. The population of the colonies was small, and the number of Englishmen anxious to come as servants was large. Readjustments in the English economy during the late 16th and early 17th centuries worked serious hardships on many British subjects who suffered through periodic depressions and famines. Vagabondage, crime, and destitution all increased markedly as public awareness of these problems. Increased concern was expressed both by greater attention to charity and by savage representation of the criminal and rowdy and the idle. Impoverished Britons were were only too anxious to start anew in America, where radically different conditions promised some of hope, some of hope, no, some hope of success, and where they were actually wanted rather than regarded as a burden. But so too were many skilled and semi-skilled workers who saw their opportunities decline at home. Recent studies of servant immigrants in the 17th century suggest that they were overwhelmingly young and male, but represented a wide diversity of occupations, with perhaps as many as one-half having some skill. The tide of immigration reached its peak in the 3rd quarter of the 17th century, when, spurred by a series of 10 crop failures, political dislocations at home, and a strong colonial demand for labor, close to 47,000 Englishmen came to Virginia alone. Think of like uh, Star or Eagle, Idaho. You don't know about those places, but yeah, think about those places. Just like a good-sized town. Isn't that crazy? If the supply of servants seemed abundant during most of the 17th century, that of slaves was limited at best. The English were latecomers to the African slave trade, which, throughout the first 2/3 of the century, was primarily run in Portuguese and then Dutch hands. Only after the Anglo-Dutch War of 1664 to 1667 was English naval superiority established. Shortly thereafter, in 1672, the Royal African Company, with a theoretical monopoly of the English slave trade, was formed. Even then, the supply of Africans remained limited, despite the anguished cries of British planters in the West Indies, where the most lucrative colonies were located, and the Royal African Company was unable, excuse me, to supply a sufficient quantity of slaves, other one, shut up. West Indian planters mounted vigorous attacks on the company's monopoly, and even before 1698, when the monopoly was formally lifted, private traders illegally supplied a large portion of the island's laborers. If there were not enough Africans for the West Indies, where the need was greatest, the number of available for export to the mainland, which was of relatively small economic importance, small indeed. Did I read that right? I have no clue what I just read. Sorry. Let's read that again. It's fine. If there were not enough Africans for the West Indies, where the need, oh no, he died. Hey, he got a prize box though. It's okay. If there were not enough Africans for the West Indies, where the need was greatest, the number available for export to the mainland, which was of relatively small economic importance, was small indeed. Until the last third of the century, most of the slaves imported to the mainland colonies were probably bought from Dutch and other private merchants, so it's not surprising that that New York, where the Dutch had early encouraged the importation of slaves had a higher proportion of blacks in its population than any other English mainland colony except South Carolina as late as 1680. Excuse me. During the half century from 1680 to 1730, these conditions impeding the importation of slaves changed radically. The growing prosperity of many colonists meant that an increasing number of them were able to afford slaves. The growth in the number of wealth in large holdings was especially significant. These large planters who could afford to make initial investments and whose need for labor was the greatest were the principal purchasers of slaves. In Maryland, for example, the average net worth of the richest 10% of the Beta estates increased 241% between 1656 and 1683, 1713 and 1719, far more than increasing among smaller estates. As consequence, the proportion of all wealth owned by the richest 10% increased from 43% to 64%. Since servants were only temporarily bound and did not produce new servants, as the colonial population grew, the number of servants imported have to had oh wait no would have had to increase sharply in order for them to form a consistent proportion of the population. The 10,910 head rights issued in Virginia between 1650 and 1654 were equivalent to more than 57% of the colony's estimated population the former year. The 10,390 issued between 1665 and 1669 were only equal to about 29% of the population in 1670. Even if the number uh, of immigrants had remained constant, they would have represented a continually decreasing percentage of the population and would soon not have become inadequate to would have become inadequate to meet the colonists' labor needs. In fact, the supply of English servants declined sharply at just the time that the demand for labor was increasing in many of the colonies. As the English social situation stabilized following the Restoration of 1660 and the British government adopted a strongly mercantilist policy, the Englishmen no longer complained as they had formerly about an excess population. No, wait, I emphasized that wrong. Uh, the Englishmen had no longer complained as they had formerly about an excess population. Instead, with an increasing in economic productivity and well-being, a large population now seemed an asset in Britain's struggle for supremacy with the other population powers, with other European powers, excuse me. Although conditions for the poor remain hard, they no longer experience continual crisis, famines, and unemployment of the early and middle 17th century. Conditions with the colonies also acted to discourage immigration. By the 17th century, land was no longer so easily accessible, acquired, as it had been earlier. Furthermore, generally declining tobacco prices may have led to merchants to reduce intentionally their importation of servants to Maryland and Virginia. The result was a rather abrupt decline in the number of British immigrants. Sorry. Okay, I'm gonna reread that. The result was a rather abrupt decline in the number of British immigrants to the colonies. In no 5-year period between 1650 and 1674 did the number of head rights issued for whites in Virginia fall below 7,900. In none between 1675 and 1699 did it rise above 6,000. The number of English servants thus declined precisely when more were needed, although Britain continued to transport convict laborers to Maryland and a growing number of German and Irish servants settled in Pennsylvania. There were simply not enough Europeans willing to settle themselves into indentured servitude in America to continue filling the labor needs of the colonies. At the same time that the supply of servants was decreasing, that of enslaved Africans was increasing, and it was changing the relative supply and hence the price of labor in the face of high, indeed growing demand, and most simply, and that wait, excuse me, demand that most simply explains the shift in nature of the colonial labor force. With the founding of the Royal African Company in 1672, Britain became the foremost slave trading country in the world. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht, Ut- I, no, no, it doesn't matter. Utrecht, Utrecht. I don't know, like German. What do I know? Utrecht. Okay. 1713, by the Treaty of the Utrecht, the English won the asiento or monopoly awarded by the Spanish government to supply the Spanish colonies with slaves. The 18th century was a golden era for the English slave trade, when the British merchants provided slave labor for most of the world's colonies. Given the heightened demand for labor and the new availability of Africans, planters who need a large, stable forces and had good reason to prefer slaves to indentured servants, even had the supply of the latter not begun to dwindle. For one thing, slaves were held permanently, as were their children, while servants were freed after a definite term. As a consequence, although slaves required a larger initial investment, a plantation using slaves became a self-perpetuating concern, especially by the early 18th century when slave fertility rates increased markedly. Mortality rates declined, and the black population began to grow through natural reproduction as well as importation. A plantation using indentured servants, however, required the continual replenishment of the labor force. Equally important, servants tended to disrupt the efficient working of a farm or plantation by running away. Although slaves too attempted to escape, it was more difficult for them to succeed. Their color made them easily identifiable and naturally suspect. That's not funny. I don't know why I laughed. Don't laugh at that. White servants, on the other hand, had little trouble pretending to be free, and the shortage of labor rendered it easy for fugitives to find employment. As a result, the flight of indentured servants was a common and widely lamented occurrence. The colonies have adopted estrangement penalties for fugitives, usually involving their serving additional time, and for subsequent offenses, branding or mutilation. Wow. Newspaper advertisements for fugitives give evidence for both scope and problem that was treated that and the treatment of servants. Here. Typical notice in the Pennsylvania Gazette of 18 of June 18th, 1752 offered a 5-pound reward for the return of to his West Jersey master of an Irish servant man named Thomas Bunn, a thick, well-set fellow of middle stature, full-faced, little pockmarked, and his face cut off, and his hair cut off. Excuse me. He speaks pretty good English and pretends to be something of a shoemaker. He has a scar on his belly and is marked on the upper side of his right thumb with TB. A comparison of the number of slaves and servants from New Jersey listed in the newspaper advertisements with the number of slaves listed in New Jersey. Wait, no, I'm not. Okay, I'm not going crazy. In New Jersey, wills suggest how much more often indentured servants escaped than did slaves. Although more than 4 times as many slaves as servants were listed in the wills of 1751 to 1760. In 1753 and 1754, there were 54 notices of fugitive servants and only 17 of slaves. In other words, servants were apparently escaping at a rate at about 13 times as high as that of slaves. For planters, this kind of discrepancy must have been a powerful argument in favor of using slaves. That kind of reverses like the whole statistic thing that they use today, the 13% thing. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a statistics guy, I don't know anything, but, you know, that kind of reverses it in a way, because, yeah, you had a lot more white people running away than black people. Just my view on it though. So just to prove that I'm not just prove that I'm not racist, everybody. All right, shut up. Discontent with the white labor is not confined to the problem of fugitives. The prevalent labor shortage together with the availability of land, encouraged an independent mode of thought on the part of supposedly subordinate white workers who knew they would have little trouble finding employment no matter what their behavior. That was extremely distasteful to employers. After complaining about the high price of blacks, New York planter politician Cadwallader Holden noted that uh, our chief loss is from want of white hands. The hopes of having land of their own and becoming independent of landlords is what chiefly induces people into America, and they think they have never answered the design of their coming till they have purchased land, which as soon as possible they do and begin improve even before they are able to uh, maintain, I don't know why, maintain themselves. That slavery, end quote. That slavery did not allow for the development of this kind of independence among laboring class was one of the more. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm reading this like completely out of whack. That slavery did not allow for the development of this kind of independence among the laboring class and was one more consideration in its favor. The key determination of the kind of labor systems that emerged in the American colonies was the degree to which agriculture was geared to the market. Although the increased availability of Africans made it possible the widespread adoption of slave labor after 1680, slavery became the backbone of the economy in some colonies, while in others it made little to or no advance. Where basic sub yeah, where basic subsistence agriculture was practiced, as in most of New England, farms were small, and the labor of a farmer and his family, and perhaps one or two extra hands at harvest time, was quite sufficient, and there was little need for forced labor. When crops were grown for export, planters sought to maximize their production and extend the acreage planted. In such areas, which included much but not all of the southern colonies, the demand for labor was great, and the indentured servitude that characterized agricultural operations prior to the 1680s gave way to slave labor, where commercial agriculture was practiced on a smaller scale, as in the middle of the colonies. Oh, sorry. Where commercial agriculture was practiced on a smaller scale, as in the middle colonies, the labor system was less uniform. Some places, such as Pennsylvania, the indentured servitude remained widespread. In others, families augmented their own labor with that of occasional hired uh, hands. And in others, most notably parts of New York, slavery was institution of some importance. All right. A brief examination of the geographic distribution of slaves illustrates the close connection between agricultural expansion and the widespread of forced labor. In the British mainland colonies, large-scale commercial development developed first in the Chesapeake Bay region. So, you know, um, obviously Maryland. I don't know why I'm telling you that. You can figure that out yourself. You have Google. Oh, okay. As early as 1617, tobacco was grown in the start quote in the streets and even in the marketplace of Jamestown, end quote. A Dutch traveler reported of Maryland and Virginia in 1679 that tobacco is the only production in which the planters employ themselves, as if there was nothing else in the world to plant. Unquote. Spurred by a seemingly insatiable European demand for the new weed and blessed with a good soil, a mild climate, and an excellent system of water routes, Chesapeake Bay planters produced increasing quantities of tobacco throughout the 17th century. The 20,000 pounds exported in 1619 swelled to 175,590,000 in 1672, and 353 million I think over 353 million in 1697. After which, despite annual fluctuations varying with tobacco prices, average yields stabilized for the next generation. With an abundance of land and a shortage of labor, the amount of tobacco a planter could raise depended primarily on the number of workers he could command, relying throughout most of the 17th century on a continual supply of fresh indentured servants, beginning in the 1680s when the number of white immigrants had begun to decline sharply and African slaves had become more readily available. Planters turned to slave labor. Wesley Frank Craven's computation of slave imports into Virginia based on the number of black head rights granted shows a marked increase beginning in 1690, and just shows numbers. Oh yeah. So yeah, 1650, 1654, 162. That just keeps swelling up. Not that much. Kind of fluctuates a little bit. I mean, it's like steadily rising until at 1680, like it said, and then you get more, and then it swells up to about 1,000. Like you had 388 at the beginning of 1680, and by about 1700, but well, from 1695 to 1699, that rose to 1,043. So yeah, it's swelling a lot. Excuse me. He suggests, however, that the greatly expanded number of black headrights in the 1690s is substantially representative of postponed claims for Negroes reaching the colony somewhat earlier. There we go. Corroborative evidence comes from a calculation that in New York County, Virginia, the ratio of servants to slaves plummeted from 1.90 in 1680 to 1684 to 0.27 in 1685 to 1689, 0.07 in 1690 to 1694. Within a decade, servants had virtually stopped coming to the county. Sorry, talking about New York County, Virginia. By 1700, when more than one quarter of Virginia's population was black, the revolution in the composition of the colony's labor force had been largely completed. In Maryland, too, the number of slaves increased markedly, although because large parts of Maryland were unsuited for tobacco growing and because the colony continued to receive substantial shipments of convict servants, the change occurred slightly later than in Virginia and was less dramatic. Even though more heavily dependent on slave labor, although later in development was South Carolina. First settled by Europeans in the 1660s, it grew slowly as colonists sought in vain to find a staple that would pay for them in the same role that tobacco did in Virginia. They raised cattle and hogs for sale to the West Indies, and also exported deerskins and naval stores. Because of the large role played by the West Indian planters in the settling of South Carolina, the colony from the beginning had a higher percentage of slaves than in the other mainland colonies. Although, as elsewhere from Pennsylvania south, most of the early immigrants were white indentured servants. Then, in the 1690s, Carolinians discovered rice, a crop that within a few years became as much as a staple for them as tobacco was for planters of the Chesapeake. American rice shipments to England, almost all of which came from South Carolina and from the middle of the 18th century, Georgia, increased from less than 1% of the total value of American shipments to England in 1697 to 1705, to 12% in 1721 to 1730, and 24% in 1766 to 1775. Even more than in Virginia, South Carolina's commercial orientation created society in which most heavy labor was coerced. With a population of only little more than 1,000 in 1680, the colony by 1740 claimed 40,000 residents, of whom approximately two-thirds were slaves. Slavery excuse me, hold on. Slavery was much less central in the northern colonies and consequently proved relatively easy to abolish without serious social dislocations in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Nevertheless, it is worth noting that unfree labor was of some importance in parts of the north as late as the middle of the 18th century. In Pennsylvania, spurred in part by an active propaganda campaign waged by William Penn and his agents who sought to convince impoverished Europeans of the boundless opportunities that awaited them in the colony, tens of thousands of indentured servants, many of them German, continued to form a significant share of the agricultural labor. By far the largest concentration of slaves outside the southern colonies, however, was located in New York. Late as 1760, about one of every seven New Yorkers was a black slave. And they talked about the large black population. Where we at, man? How you doing? Okay, just making sure. That's a good score, man. 2 million. That's what I got. Although both the Dutch, who ruled the colony as New Netherlands until 1667, and the British, who came there after them and actively promoted the importation of Africans, this polity would have met with little success wait, sorry, excuse me. This policy would have met with little success had conditions there not been conducive to their employment. Wherever water transportation was available, especially on Long Island, Staten Island, and along the banks of the Hudson River, large planters, beneficiaries of huge land grants from both the Dutch and the English, grew a variety of crops for sale. The most important of these was wheat. Uh, uh, Wheat is a staple of this province, end quote, explained New York's governor in 1734. It is generally manufactured into flour and bread and is sent to supply sugar colonies. End quote. Slaves appeared wherever this large quantities of wheat or other crops were raised for export. On Long Island, for example, they increased from 14% of the population in 1698 to 21% in 1738. Of course, some New Yorkers, especially in the city, employed slaves as house servants, and others possessed slaves who performed various trades. In the typical owner, however, was a farmer with 1 to 5 slaves who used them to supplement his family's labor and increase the amount of its product available for sale. Slavery was the least important in New England, where small farms and largely self-sufficient agricultural required little labor that a farmer's family could not provide. In the 17th century, the New England colonies contained relatively new indentured servants, and those few more often served as domestics and artisans than as agricultural laborers. In the early 18th century, blacks constituted about 2% of the population in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, and few of them were farm workers. They were a luxury for those who could afford them rather than an essential part of the economy. The one area of New England where extensive use of slaves prevailed nicely illustrates the impact of commercially oriented agriculture on the labor system of colonial America. In the fertile flatlands of the I'm gonna butcher this, uh, Narragansett, I think it's Narragansett region of Rhode Island, there arose a system of large-scale rocks raising and dairy farming. There, no, wait, no. There arose a system of large-scale stock raising and dairy farming. There, on soil ideally suited for grazing, planters bred the famed Narragansett race horses. I'm butchering this, dude. I feel so stupid. Raised herds of sheep and dairy cows and developed an aristocratic lifestyle similar to that of Virginia and Carolina planters. Estates of hundreds and sometimes thousands of acres require a largely steady laboring population, and it is no accident that slavery, both Negro and Indian, reached development in colonial Narragansett. Wait, reached development in colonial Narragansett, unusual in the colonies north of Mason and Dixon's Line. End quote. I didn't realize those were, sorry. In 1730, about 10% of Rhode Island's population was black, but this figure conceals widespread variations in uh, Narragansett country townships of South Kingston and Jamestown, from one-fifth to one-quarter of the inhabitants were black. Including Indians, about one-third were slaves, and in many other areas of Rhode Island, black constituted no more than 3 to 4% of the population, as elsewhere in the colonies. Wait, no, excuse me. As elsewhere in the colonies, slavery in Rhode Island was strong only where it was substantial market orientation, agriculture. Dude, I don't even know what I'm reading anymore, man. I do, but like, it's just I'm like glossing over it. I'm probably making it really confusing for you guys. That's my bad. You guys, nobody's there. Over the course of the 17th and first part of the 18th centuries, unfree labor gradually became entrenched and solidified in the American South. If at first serfdom and slavery had emerged as institutions designed to help landholders cope with the specific problems of labor shortage, by the middle of the 18th century, they appeared part of the natural order, as God-given as government or agriculture itself. A central feature of this process of entrenchment was the hardening and clarification of class lines, so that the welter of overlapping groups that still prevailed in much of the 17th century had coalesced by the 18th into a well-delineated class, into well-delineated classes. The masters and their bondsmen, of course, there remained two intermediate groups, people who did not fit into either of these major classes. These two, however, dominated society and gave shape to the social order. It was not at first obvious that this would be so. In the English mainland colonies, class lines were still fluid during most of the 17th century, and a variety of laborers ranging from slave through semi-free free rubbed shoulders. What am I saying? And a variety of laborers ranging from slave through semi-free to free rubbed shoulders. Indentured servants continued to arrive in some colonies, most notably, oh, most notably Pennsylvania. And he continued to provide a large share of agricultural laborers well into the 18th century. There were still Indian slaves and criminals. No, wait, no, there were still Indian slaves. Criminals and debtors were routinely uh, bound uh, bound out to work as servants, and as were children learning a trade. Nor were the statutes of all blacks immediately clear. There were some who served as indentured servants, especially during the first two-thirds of the 17th century. And for several decades, the notion persisted among the colonists that the conversion of American slaves to Christianity, the conversion, the conversion of African slaves to Christianity might necessitate their manumission. The very term slave lacked precision, and was sometimes used for someone who temporarily deprived of freedom, who was only temporarily deprived of freedom. And 1639, for example, a white man, John Kemp, for filthy, unclean attempts with three young girls, was censured to be whipped very severely and was committed for a slave. End quote. In this case, and several others from the same period of slavery imposed was only temporary, but it is significant that the nature of slavery and freedom could remain so ill-defined in the 1630s and 1640s. The early colonists were familiar with continuum of unfree and semi-free statuses and did not yet see the black slaves off from other laborers as an entirely separate class. Of course, the Africans were different and perceived as such, but so too were they differentiated from one another on the basis of national origins. Among Carolina planters, for example, Caramantes and Waitas, I think it's White is. I can't believe I don't know. I can't believe I'm getting these wrong. White is because their greater hardiness were supposed to be especially desirable as field hands, whereas Igbos, Congos, and Angolas allegedly weaker and were said to be more effective as house servants. End quote. Uh, the rigid dichotomy uh, of later years between black and white, slave and free, did not yet exist. Flexibility was evident in South Carolina slavery that as late as the early years of the 18th century, when although blacks were already a majority of the labor force, there was considerably leeway in what was expected from them. Until until 1720s, servants and masters shared the crude and egalitarian intimacies and inevitable on a frontier. Intimacies inevitable on a frontier. End quote. Because of the lack of white manpower in this frontier environment, slaves performed a multitude of jobs that would later be considered inappropriate and that sometimes involved considerable initiative, independence, and free association with whites. Thus, slaves served as hunters, trappers, guides, sailors, and fishermen. They were even used to fight Indians, as in the Yama- Yamasee War of 1715. I don't know how to say it. In Virginia, hold on, Virginia Chance. In Virginia, where until shortly before the turn of the century, blacks were still a small portion of the population, and most unfree workers were white. Racial lines seemed even less firmly drawn. Black and white agricultural laborers often worked together, and in his 1705 description of Virginia, Robert Beverly noted that the male servants and slaves, both sexes, are employed together in tilling and manuring the ground. End quote. Although some distinction indeed is made between them in their clothes and food. End quote. White women were no longer as assigned field work. Excuse me. Black and white laborers also fraternized with one another, shared living accommodations, and sometimes ran away together. Indeed, black and white slave servant, and often sex ex-servant, sorry, ex-servant, as well as were all part of the general underclass. Giddy multitude that in the third quarter of the 17th century showed growing restiveness and caused considerable unease among the well-to-do. That's interesting. That actually is really interesting. Wow, that's interesting. Like it was just not, at least according to this. I mean, again, I don't know everything, but it seems kind of less. It was less racist back then. I mean, you had white and black servants kind of serving together. They kind of nice. This dude has 1 million hoverboards. 999,000. No, 9 million. Wow. Just how fluid class alliances still were demonstrated by Bacon's rebellion, a conflict that erupted in 1676 when Nathaniel Bacon led an uprising against the government of Governor William Berkeley, an uprising that achieved the momentary success before its leader caught ill and died of the bloody flux, and his forces disintegrated. One of a series of violent upheavals that shook the colonies in the 1760s no 1670s and 1680s. Bacon's rebellion seemed destined to bear out all the worst fears about getting multitude. Although historians have disagreed sharply over the nature of the rebellion, what is significant here is not Bacon's goal so much as a composition of his forces. which cut across racial and class lines, pushing toward a world rid of color lines. Enlisted in Bacon's ranks was incongruous medley of disaffected Virginians, slaves, indentured servants, debtors, ex-servants, frontiersmen, chafing, I don't know, under Berkeley's restrained Indian policy and political enemies of the governor. That such an alliance was possible, and the government and the governor's supporters did not make an issue of the participation of blacks on the side of the rebels and indicate how little slavery had yet shaped class attitudes. Here you go, Sugi. Such a configuration of forces, as was seen in Bacon's rebellion, would have been impossible in the southern colonies by the early 18th century. The rapid spread of slavery and the decline in the number of servant immigrants meant that blacks, instead of constituting one element of a complex, turbulent underclass, were now the backbone of the labor force. Class lines were becoming more and more approximate to racial lines. The change was not just one of numbers, the social distance between blacks and whites increased too. As plantation labor became to be associated with slaves, there was a perceptible rise in the status, treatment, and economic well-being of most white colonists. Not only were fewer whites coming over as indentured servants, but those who did not didn't did tended to uh, those who did tended to be from a somewhat higher social rank, often possessing mechanical skills much in demand in the colonies. David W. Gallinson, after examining the backgrounds of 2,955 servants leaving England for Jamaica, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia between 1718 and 1759, found that most were skilled, 65% of men were literate, and only 6% listed in their occupation as laborers. Equally important were the changed conditions they met in the colonies. As fewer servants arrived, the colonists felt stronger pressure to treat them tolerably because only by convincing prospective immigrants that they faced a bright future in America could the colonists generate continued immigration. Of course, even at the height of the immigration in the 1650s and 1660s, the need to course, even at the height of the immigration, wait, sorry, the need to attract laborers had mitigated against treatment so harsh as to discourage other would-be servants from indenturing themselves. Here's one reason, as Edmund Morgan has suggested, that indentured servants were never actually reduced to slaves, but when the economic and political dislocations leading Englishmen to flee their country had largely disappeared. The need to offer positive incentives to potential immigrants was much greater. Relatively few immigrants who continued to perform agricultural labor were increasingly differentiated from slaves. As Beverly noted in stressing differences in food, clothing, treatment, and treatment of women, and treatment of women. Period there. The economic well-being of white immigrants in the colonies also improved. Not only were they employed more often skilled in trades, but uh, as the general economic level of the colonies improved, they were more able to translate the heavy demand for their services into better material conditions. There's no such improvement in the status of blacks who came to America involuntarily and did not have to be lured by attractive conditions. In fact, as the ranks of the indentured servants diminished and as their condition improved, the blacks seemed increasingly different and threatening, and there was a decrease in the fraternization and sense of common cause that had once existed between black and white in the laboring underclass. Contributing to this growing isolation of black slaves was the fact that, whereas previously most had spent time in the West Indies, where they had already been seasoned before coming to the United States, from the 1680s, and the majority were imported directly from Africa, spoke no English on arrival, and consequently seemed more alien to white Americans. By the turn of the century, the pervasive fear of the giddy multitude had disappeared. Southern colonists of the 18th century dreading, what are they doing? Oh, I like Frank. That was weird. But yeah, I like Frank. Frank's cool. Oh, you're gonna use Frizzy. I haven't seen that before. Okay. Southern colonists of the 18th century dreaded the rebellion too, but the fears of a servile insurrection, an uprising by black slaves against the whites. The growing tide of slave imports and changed relations between whites and blacks led to a sharp rise in white racial consciousness and widespread expressions of fear that its too large slave population threatened the peace. Wait, a fear that too large a slave population threatened the peace of the community. As Virginia planter William Bird, himself a large slave owner, it's BYRD, sorry, that's why I'm confused. William Byrd, himself a large slave owner, wrote to Earl Egmont in 1736, congratulating him on the temporary prohibition of slavery in the new colony of Georgia. They import so many Negroes hither that I fear this colony will sometime or other be confirmed by the name of New Guinea. The far the the farther importation of them in our colonies should be prohibited, lest they prove as troublesome and dangerous everywhere, as they have been lately in Jamaica. The result of a rash of colonial legislation designed to regulate slaves, codification of slavery lagged well behind its actual establishment. In Virginia, blacks had an uncertain legal status until 1661, and it was only 1664 that a Maryland law spelled out that all Negroes and other slaves shall deserve uh, durant, durante vida. I don't know what that means. So long as there were relatively few blacks in the colonies, there seemed little need to pass elaborate legislation defining their status and uh, regulating their behavior. During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, however, the southern colonies passed a series of laws des designated to set blacks off from whites, legitimize slavery, and protect the society from potential servile insurrections. These laws range from reassurances that conversion to Christianity did not require manumission, as in Virginia's Act of 1667 and Maryland's of 1671, measures of prohibiting free blacks from voting, testifying in court against whites, or marrying whites, to the establishment of slaves patrols. The, oh man, slave patrol. The establishment of slave patrols to guard against suspicious behavior and the passage of duties, in part, designated to stern the importation of Africans and thus safeguard public security. By the middle of the 18th century, slavery was solidly entrenched as a labor system in the southern colonies, from Maryland to Georgia. Whereas a century earlier, freedom was a vague concept, and a lot and the excuse me, wait, where was I? Freedom was a vague concept, and the lot of most laborers, white and black, was to an extent or another unfree. Now the assumption was practically universal among whites that slavery was a natural state of blacks, and freedom that of whites. Blacks were simply different. Kindness to a Negro, by the way, of reward for having done well, is the surest way to spoil him, although according to the general observation of the world, most men are spurred on to diligence by rewards, wrote Virginia planter Landon Carter, 1770. 8 years later, he expressed the same sentiment more bluntly. Blacks are devils, he proclaimed, and to make them otherwise, slaves will be set devils free. Uh, wait, and to make them otherwise, the slaves will be to set devils free. I see. Well, that's interesting. One thing I just noticed is that, um, I mean, I noticed a lot of things. I'm just trying to articulate it. Slavery wasn't really much like not no, not sla racism. Like there was obviously racism. Racism's always been a thing, I believe, but it's just kind of the thought of, hey, you look different, you stuck, and that still happens. Like it's they're not no, nothing different. Like that happen. I mean, that happens between humans, even like not even race, but I think that's what it comes down to. And then you get stereotypes, and then it's stuff that comes through it. But beforehand, when you had indentured servants who were white and like, black slaves coming in, it was kind of just I don't know. They were both in the same boat, and so they just kind of had a growing I guess camaraderie, and so there was just a lot less racism. I thought that was pretty cool. And it was just, I mean, it was mostly because the slaves spoke English, like, so they could actually, you know, articulate thoughts. I mean, once you brought the ones that didn't speak English in here, you thought, everyone thought they're kind of stupid, and you know, like not only stupid, but I don't know. You get the gist. But um, so that brings us back to our question: how did the English choose the type of labor in the colonies? Well, they chose what was cheapest and what was most readily available. I mean, what was stopping them from doing slavery in the first place was that, well, not only was it a monopoly of the what was it called? The West Indies Company. Is that what it's called? No, the Royal. Ah, doesn't that doesn't matter. Before the monopoly was set up, it didn't really. Oh, hey Kroger. Um, but they chose what was cheapest, which is indentured servitude, which also was the one that was easiest to get by. Because once slavery was readily available, even when that was the company was founded, they still didn't fully set in because there was no point when indentured servitude was not only cheaper, it was less of an investment, and it was just more readily available. However, once you had a more of an abundance coming in, especially with trained slaves, coming from the West Indies, you like um I mean they were like, oh man, these guys are like well seasoned, and I can not pay them. I have to train them, but that's it. Um, and so it just became easier. So yeah, they kind of just chose off of what was cheaper. Um, and then once even cheaper method was uncovered, they were like, hey, let's do that. Once the other one was kind of being rendered obsolete. Um, I feel like I mean, I might be missing something, but I think this is productive. How long has that taken me? About an hour. Yeah, about an hour. Thought so. Well, man, that was a good read there. That was a really good read. I mean, that sucked, but it was I did learn something. This is an experiment to see if I'd actually retain the knowledge by like reading it out loud, and like I'm reading it to somebody. And I think this worked. I think that was kind of cool. I should just do this, even though no one watched. I mean, yeah, this would be cool. And look at this guy go. Pretty good. The comments saying here. What are we talking about? Huh? I'm not the only one studying. I mean, I wasn't studying. I was kind of putting that up for you. Like I didn't want you to get distracted. Like, I wasn't looking at it the whole time. I was glancing up at it when like something interesting was happening. But yeah, wow. Well, history's a cool thing, isn't it? Oh man, Trick's kind of bad. Tricky, whatever her name is. All right, well, doesn't matter. Well. this was a special report with Bingus, aka OG Willikers, aka that N-word, and uh, racism was bad. Slavery was pretty bad. Um, never repeat history. That's kind of like a cool thing you can do. Not do. Um, and that it's not illegal to say that the best place to birdwatch is from the top of the Rockefeller Hewitt building in Washington, D.C. to a clear line of sight of a tree right outside the president's bedroom. Yeah, just wanted to tell you that. That was a joke. That was a joke. That's not only code word. I'm not actually planning on. I'm not telling you guys to go do something. But yeah. All right. Wow, that sounded really bad. That was a joke. That was actually just a joke. Oh man. Okay, I'm already gonna watch this anyway. I think. No, I'm not. Ah, no, I'm not. It's fine. Oh, say goodbye, kitty cat. Oh, say goodbye. This is my cat. Her name's Peter. No, I'm kidding. His name's Nala. Isn't that right, Nala? All right. Okay. Bye.